you very much for coming this evening. I'm surprised by the size of the audience, considering the beautiful weather and how lovely Leicester is at this time of year. As a Catholic, we don't often get to stand in this position, so I often feel a little bit conflicted when I'm asked to do these presentations. When Simon asked me to speak, about a year ago actually, it seemed something that was very easy to say yes to. And as I was travelling up, I thought, actually, I'm not sure if I've got enough to tell you. And the reason why I doubt myself at this moment is because I'm not a theologian. I don't know my Greek translations of Leviticus and how it might conflict with the new translations under the second interpretation of Bible. I'm not that person. And I'm not that person who can necessarily provide every biblical rationale for the acceptance of LGBT people in the church. I'm a campaigner, I'm an activist, and I'm a Christian, and it is from that perspective that I will talk with you today. For those of you who've heard me talk before, I will try and vary my passion a little, but there might be some repetition. The other thing I have to apologise for is Simon emailed me a couple of weeks ago saying, can I have a copy of your lecture? To which I had to say no, because actually I don't write lectures, and the reason I don't write lectures is because I'm very, very dyslexic, so reading stuff out is never something that works well for me. And also I like to keep the Stonewall comms team on their feet because they're never quite sure what's going to happen. And I think what I would say is, please feel free to share anything on social media this evening, but if I do talk about my parents, could you not talk about them? They prefer not to read about my interpretation of their upbringing via the medium of Twitter. And I respect that as part of our relationship. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my history and my faith within that, and my journey parallel with that with Stonewall and as a campaigner, and where I think we are today as a society, as communities, in a world that feels increasingly fractured and fracturing. What is the role more broadly for inclusive Christianity, and how can we play a role in that? Of which sexual orientation and gender identity is an element of that, but it is an element of which we often become the canary in the coal mine, really, for other dissatisfaction and division in our societies. So, I was born in 1980 to a Catholic family. My parents and my extended family were very Catholic in a way that was quite natural. Brought up in Wales. Wales is not a big Catholic country, but that probably is why my parents went for it. And we absolutely had a normal Catholic upbringing, and we went to our local school, and we went to our local church, and we were very much part of the community. And as a child, as I think quite a lot of children brought up in the Christian faith, that was our normal. You know, we had our first communion, we had baptisms, my cousins all came through the schools, and the school was an absolute place of safety, security, and moral values, a moral heart. In the early 80s and 90s, in my day, we didn't talk about sex very much. We certainly didn't talk about sexual orientation, and I'll talk about that more in detail. We did talk about love, and we talked about respect, and we talked about treating each other well. When I reached 11, 12, I of course started thinking about all sorts of matters of faith, but I'm a studious reader, and by the age of 11 I had probably read the Bible twice in school. I didn't know long division, but we certainly knew our Bible at our Catholic school. And at the age of 11, what I've been struck by is of course, the story of Ruth. Every child in the world goes to their story. And the relationship between Ruth and Naomi, which I didn't then and I don't now interpret as a same-sex relationship. What I did interpret it as a woman acting against convention and doing what she believed to be right when society was asking her to do something different. And the loyalty that Ruth demonstrates to Naomi it moves me now, and it moves me then. My brother is called Thomas, and my parents were very clear that the reason why they called him Thomas was because he was the one apostle when everybody was saying, this is how it is, said, I don't believe you, it's not how it is. You know, I do not accept that 9 of you have told me it's like this, and I'm just going to go along with that. So my parents, although very hugely respectful of God and the Catholic tradition and the Catholic faith, we believe in one holy Catholic church, were very clear that Ruth and Tom both did something quite different. And so the narrative in our family was Ruth and Tom had done something quite different. And that was an important part. It was not incongruous with one's faith. It was absolutely in keeping with God's will that one should sometimes challenge the the status quo and the authority around you. When I was 12, I was beginning to realise I was attracted to women, girls, but that didn't really have any impact on my faith whatsoever. What superseded that big thought was the death of my aunt at the age of 12. And when I was 12, she was 32, died in childbirth, and had 3 little kids under 5. And what happened at that key moment in an adolescent life is those children came to live with us. And we were part of this Catholic school, and we were part of this Catholic community. So suddenly the church and our school wrapped itself around us. And the hymns and the Bible readings and all that stuff became profoundly important to me. In a way that fancying girls didn't seem like a big deal. I certainly didn't question that was a wrong thing or a bad thing. Bearing in mind I was at school during Section 28, so there was no mention whatsoever of homosexuality in schools in any context. But at 14, I remember talking to my priest and saying, "Father, I think I'm attracted to girls, not boys." And he said, "The most important thing, kid, is to do your GCSEs, all right?" And that was actually, I know that in reflection in 2018 we may have more guidance for what our priest might say in these given moments, he might well have had more say to me, but actually that's kind of what I needed to hear. Get your head down, get on with your work, don't get too distracted. And I think that was an incredibly important moment for me, where I'd obviously wound myself up over 2 years, this might be a problem, but actually kind of completely de-escalated. And as I continued growing up, I studied English at A-level and went on to study English at Oxford. And during all that that time, 13 to 18, was reading Julian of Norwich, was reading C.S. Lewis, was reading the Bible, and still that rich Christian tradition stayed very much as part of my discourse and dialogue and thinking. And I think you can't really study English at Oxford. English at Oxford, you do everything from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf. Anything past Virginia Woolf, who was 1910, 1915, is considered a bit too modern for Oxford. And anything not British is considered a bit too modern for Oxford. So, you can't really get away from the influence of the Bible on English literature from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf. You read Milton, you're reading the Bible. You read Blake, you're reading the Bible. All this stuff is integral. When I did go to Oxford, though, I went back into the closet. I didn't really talk about my faith at all. Mainly because when you go to university, I think, particularly Oxford, you kind of have to choose your tribe. And I very much chosen the gay tribe, and Cathsoc was pretty hardcore at Oxford. So what I found myself doing is going to local parish churches. And there was something quite comforting about going to family churches, rather than a kind of hardcore theological Dominican monk kind of university approach. And I just didn't feel I was Catholic enough to be allowed into that space. And I didn't feel like I could hold my own in that space. And I was also very out. I was president of my college and president of the student union, and was very clearly out. But I think I just kind of posited that bit because it wasn't really something to talk about. I think when I left university, 21 to 25, I lost God a bit in that time. And I remember feeling incredibly angry that the organised church and organised religion continued to say nothing about me. I think that the Catholic Church speaks great volumes about gay men, barely recognises trans people, and lesbians just don't exist. And that was about me understanding female sexuality and about the role of women in the church. And I remember behaving in a way that was unbecoming of a Catholic girl, I think, and feeling deeply sad and going, I can't believe God has forsaken me. Why would God leave me? And having quite a profound realisation that he hasn't left, I left him. But that came at a time when I was thinking, if I'm going to be hung for being gay, I might as well do as much gay stuff as I can, to hell with the consequences and the feelings of my partner. And let's basically, if you're going to do it, let's do it. And it took me maturing to realise that was deeply uncomfortable for me, and that was undermining my values and my integrity, and that's actually what my faith comes from. So I'm giving you a very whistle-stop tour into something that has obviously taken years of therapy to unpick, but it was a really important moment for me as I went forward. I joined Stonewall when I was 25, so the two things coincided. And Stonewall in 2005 was quite an interesting organisation. In those days we were 25 staff and a turnover of about 1.7 million. Stonewall doesn't take any government funds at all, mainly because they were never offered. 2018, we're probably closing on about 8 million and we've got 140 staff. So it gives you a sense of quite how much the organisation has grown and changed. So when I took over in 2014 as CEO, we were about half that size. So it's been growing and growing and growing. But in 2005, my predecessor is a guy called Ben Summerskill. Stonewall was relentlessly pursuing what I would describe as an assimilationist agenda. It was pursuing an agenda where we were as good as you. Every establishment, every institution we talked to, we were about making them feel better about the gay thing. Whether that was politicians, whether it was employers, schools, it was all about presenting a very nice, neat idea of gay. And I know that in those, and I use the word gay deliberately, Stonewall wasn't trans-inclusive in those days, barely mentioned bisexuality at all. And I remember as a lesbian, as a little baby dyke, number 3 haircut, baggy jeans, turning on the lights, kind of being really encouraged to what I would describe as femme up, make myself a little bit more palatable to the men we were trying to influence. Maybe start wearing brooches, I encountered a huge number of people who tried to help me on my way and my journey. And I think that when I became, this went on for a good decade of kind of different ways of influencing them. When I became CEO in 2014, I was very clear that I didn't want to carry on the organisation in that way. I thought and think there is a way of both influencing establishment organisations and being able to acknowledge the complexity, richness and diversity of this LGBTQI communities. I don't think that's incongruous. It's a bit of a stretch at times, I've got to say. Premier League, we do not go into non-binary identities with the Premier League, but there is a possibility to keep these two things together. When I was the Deputy Director of Public Affairs, I once took a call, I was on Mediaphone, and took a call from one of the gay media outlets who said, "We've heard that Soho is closing down its Catholic gay masses. Does Stonewall have a view?" And I said, yes, Ruth, the Deputy Director of Public Affairs, says that it's a real shame they're closing down Catholic masses because it's a really important part. And the journalist said, "Do you know any gay Catholics?" And I said, yeah, I'm a gay Catholic, because I was going to church and I was practicing. Deputy Director of Public Affairs is a Catholic, is not news. CEO of Stonewall is Catholic, really is news. So the first article when I became CEO, on the front page of The Independent, was "Practicing Catholic starts running Stonewall, takes over Stonewall." And that was a moment where I had quite a big decision to make. I had to decide whether I would talk about being Catholic and my faith in public, or whether I would say it's a private matter, I don't want to talk about it. I went through what could only be described as an absolute crisis of confidence about, I don't know the Greek translation of Leviticus, and someone's going to ask me about what I think about the evangelical tradition and how it should be split from the Church of England and its influence on Africa. And I don't know that stuff. What I know is that God is important, and God is love, and God is part of my life. And I had a real anxiety about that. I then thought, I'm not Catholic enough to talk about God, and God is going to judge me for not being Catholic enough to talk about God, because I'm not sure I always believe in him all the time. And then my partner said, if you're worried about what God thinks about that, I think you probably pass the test of being Christian enough to talk about being Christian. If you're concerned that he might judge you for that, I think you're all right. And I took a lot of guidance, I took some advice. And what a very wise man said to me is, Ruth, you're a campaigner and you're a communicator, and it is time that you use this opportunity in this role to talk about the role of faith in achieving social change, that you talk about your leadership and your values as it connects to your faith, and that you find ways to try and make progress with faith communities. And so that's what I chose to do. And I think over the last 4 years, I have done that to the best of my ability. I did Greenbelt. My poor atheist partner was like, why are we in a tent? Why are we in a Christian festival in a tent? This is not my idea of fun. And so I have tried to, here I am, Lord. I have tried to answer the call when it is asked of me, but with a constant sense of inadequacy, I suspect, that is not unfamiliar to many of you in this room. And I think that what I've tried to do with the Church of England is speak truth to power. And I think increasingly what Stonewall's been doing over the last 2 years is stand up for communities who do not have a voice and speak for those who do not have a voice. And I'd like to just talk now about how hard that is. And I'd like to talk to you as a group of friends about how relentless it is to continue to try and do the right thing in a culture and a context where people really don't want you to do the right thing. One of our high-level donors and supporters spoke to a junior member of staff today, Mrs. Contact, saying that he's disgusted that a Catholic is running Stonewall and that it's an indication of poor mental health on my part and I shouldn't be allowed to lead the organisation. And that I am complicit in being silent against the oppressiveness and oppression of organised religion against LGBT communities, and I should be instead condemning those communities from the rooftops. And condemning from the rooftops is not always Stonewall's technique. I am always much more likely to enjoy a good quality conversation in Lambeth Palace, albeit in a slightly odd situation sometimes. But we have to influence where we can, and Stonewall tries to influence where we can. But this year we have stood up against an increasingly vocal but small group of lesbian feminists who totally object to trans inclusion. And as a dyke running Stonewall, that's been pretty tough. Your own tribe turning on you is pretty tough. We are strongly supportive of UK Black Pride and think that the way in which other organisations have treated those who are working on UK Black Pride has been unacceptable, and we will do everything in our power to support Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, LGBT people to find their voices. If that means money, we will find money. If that's what we can do, we will do it. And lo and behold, by calling out discrimination against trans people and calling out discrimination against Black people, the volume of Ruth's lost her way, she has no sense of mission, what about the gay men, has got louder and louder and louder and louder. And there have been times as I sit in my 4th year as CEO where I think this is just really hard, actually. It's really hard to push against boundaries when those boundaries are constantly coming back in and reinforcing themselves. And I reflect on that in relation to race, and I reflect on that in relation to gender identity and trans. And for the record, I think that the abuse that trans people are experiencing now is the like of which we saw around HIV in the late 80s, and it should be a wake-up call to all of us. And that combination of the lesbians being angry about that, and the gay men being angry about us protecting Black people, and people saying we shouldn't be doing God, there's no place for God in this, feels very, very indicative of where we're at as a world. And what I've always been struck by, 13 years I've been doing gay rights, and we replicate the dynamics that are taking place externally, internally, continually, all the time. We constantly find hurt with each other, and we constantly find fault with each other, because it is easier to fall out with each other than it is to speak truth to power out there. And I say that because what we're experiencing at Stonewall is some of that collapsing in. Ruth, you hate gay men. Ruth, you hate white people. Ruth, you hate lesbians. Ruth, you hate non-Christians. And it's like, the enemy's there. And that's who we need to talk to, and that's who we need to persuade. And I think that inward looking, that collapsing that happens in civil society organisations all over the world, that feuding that happens, is what happens when things get really, really tough. And I think we're at a time when things are currently really, really tough. I think that everybody has less power than they once had. You know, you look at our Prime Minister, far less powerful than the previous Prime Ministers. You look at the President of the United States, far less power. You look at the Archbishop of Canterbury, far less power in a way. Everybody's commanding less power and simultaneously trying to control even more. And that combination is incredibly dangerous. And all our research says that in order to achieve social change, you have to hit 25%. When 25% of your extra people are converted to your cause, then it happens. So you've got your base supporters, you need to convert 25% of the rest. And I think that keeps happening in the Church of England and in Christianity. I think there is 25% outside your core group who are saying, actually, we stand with you, and God is love, and the world is really hard, so why are we excluding anybody? And something keeps pushing back. And when I see the hurt and the pain, particularly from LGBT Christians, it is something that is so deeply entrenched, we've got to try and change the narrative a little bit. I think we are a hurting community, and I find myself increasingly hurt. I recently stopped going to my Catholic church and attended an inclusive church, and I feel like I'm taking an easy way out. I mean, that's a very Catholic response to God. I feel like I'm cheating. I feel like I'm doing something. I find that we all have to shake hands with each other at the sign of peace, which is way too extrovert for this. And there's something very different about that space that I am wanting to reject, because I don't feel worth it, that I don't really feel like I'm allowed, that I don't feel I'm allowed to have a community, that I'm allowed to have a pastoral faith community. I'm talking very frankly about my instincts. I sit down on a Sunday and go, I've got to shake hands with everybody, and someone can ask me about my weekend, because that never happens in the Catholic Church, or nobody talks to each other in the Catholic Church. This is me cheating. We are encouraged to not seek comfort and solidarity with each other in the way in which society is currently building walls. We are encouraged to fear each other. We are encouraged to presume that trans women have such complex narratives that they can't possibly be part of LGBT. We're encouraged to presume that the church is our enemy. We're encouraged to presume that Orthodox Judaism hates gay people, so there's no point working with them. This polarisation that is happening. And what's interesting is that social media is no longer a reflection of that, but is driving that. And social media used to be the way in which you could take a barometer of that, and now it is creating hostility, creating division, and enhancing and polarising communities more than ever before. And we work with a peace-building organisation who works in the Sudan to try and help us work out non-violent communications between trans communities and radical feminist communities. Now, these are the lengths we're going to try and navigate this space, because the tendency to revert to hostility is really, really powerful at the moment. And I guess what that means for me personally is, if we ever needed an explicit, vocal Christian faith, now is the time. Now is the time. And I think that we desperately need to find different ways of talking to each other and building bridges, not walls. And the thing that breaks my heart about the Church of England is, I think that the issue about inclusion of LGBT people is a proxy for a bigger discussion. I don't think it's really about just LGBT issues. And I find their weakness unforgivable. I would find their defiant opposition more palatable than their weakness. And that's where my anger is reached. Catholics are a mess of contradiction. Catholics have always been a mess of contradiction. The sooner the Vatican gets a gay network group, the better, and we can actually start making some progress. The Church of England should be better than this. It's how it works. It should be able to cope with dissent and disagreement and good disagreement. I talked to Synod last year, some of you may have been there, so I was slightly undercover in that I didn't tell Stone what I was doing. And I thought, this suits you. This indecisiveness suits how you work. And we need to be better than that. So, I haven't got many easy answers for you, except that I keep praying to give strength to Stonewall and the organisation, to keep standing up to those who oppose trans people and the people in the gay community who seem to think that it's acceptable to be racist. And we will keep standing up to those who say, in the name of God, there is no place for lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people, because it's simply not true. And it has never sat comfortably with me, even at the time when it most should have sat uncomfortably with me, when I was in a time of crisis. But we need to be louder. And I think that the time for polite dissent and disagreement is passing. I think we should be angry about the way in which people are excluded from our communities. And I think we should find a way to express that anger with love and respect. But this should not be done in the name of Jesus, and it should not be done in the name of God. And I will continue in my amateurish, slightly clumsy way to do my best to speak truth to power on that. And I hope that anything we can do to support you, we will do, and anything you can do to support us, we will fully embrace. Thank you very much.